Um, Assalamu alaikum. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and Ramadan Mubarak to those who are observing this month of grace. I hope everyone of you participating in and attending this webinar is safe and in good health. I would like to welcome you all to the UNWTO Middle East webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on tourism, trying to make sense of so much or so little data with Middle East insight. This is part of the webinar series the UNWTO is organizing in every region. Before we start, I would kindly ask everyone not to hesitate to contact us at the Regional Department of the Middle East at rdme@unwto.org should you require any information that we can provide you in our field. The COVID-19 pandemic is a very unique data situation because everything is moving so quickly. It's difficult to scale existing data collection strategies. However, it's considered a data-driven pandemic. One of the advantages we have today in the fight against coronavirus that wasn't as sophisticated in the SARS outbreak of 2003 is big data and the high level of technology available. In the Middle East region, the aviation sector is massively damaged. Airspace is closed. Most of the airports are closed, and if they're open, they're without passengers. Hotels, on the other hand, are empty, and some have been turned into medical quarantines. At the same time, although the coronavirus pandemic is no doubt impacting the world around us, staying connected with consumers during these rapidly changing times is important to understand shifts in behaviors and attitudes from general purchase behaviors to the specific needs and wants of your customers. I read in a newspaper article yesterday that many international airports are making plans to return to business in the next months by applying new procedures. The plans include facial recognition devices, the application of artificial intelligence technologies and biometric scanning tools, and the design of paths starting from the entering the airport to the arrival at the aircraft doors without touching or being touched by others or travelers or anything else, including baggage. Most of these plans are still theoretical with the reopening of airports whose timing has not been determined yet, but it's certain that the way we're familiar with traveling will not be the same anymore, and it may require passengers to go to the airport 4 hours prior to departure time instead of 2 or 3 hours as we used to do before. Changes are already happening in airports. I read that in Abu Dhabi International Airport, Etihad Airways has announced the availability of special booths that monitor the temperature of passengers and airport staff, as well as heartbeat and breathing rates. It's a method of screening passengers who may present a risk of infection to others for being examined individually before they're allowed to travel or work. The company believes that these devices will be used in the long run to control other conditions that may prevent people from traveling and reduce emergency situations while flying. On this scale, commercial aviation will be different. Most probably it will not be the same as before. By checking passports only before departure and upon arrivals, what is needed will be a complete profile of the passenger's health, the medical information that represent the traveler's profile in addition to his or her condition when entering the airports will be effective only when other authorities share it, so that the travelers the traveler arrives at his or her destination and has his or her medical file, which the airport will view to facilitate the task of traffic without repeating health procedures that may be complicated. Speaking of that, many predict that the traveler will neither be able to hold on, and these are just predictions, that the confidentiality of a passenger will be different, especially the medical information data. Also, the screens that print boarding passes might disappear, since it's an easy way for transmitting the infection. The passenger will need to have his or her ticket, boarding pass, photos of his or her bags and number on a mobile phone. The bottom line is that the future of air travel, and therefore checking in hotels, may depend on new rules, which will include the collection of health data of passengers and guests. This is a challenge that all of us are facing together. However, tourism under the leadership of UNWTO will once more be there to help people and communities recover from this setback, ensuring that no one is left behind, and that we can only achieve this if we act together and with international cooperation and the spirit of solidarity around our common goals. Before I give the floor to, or rather the virtual floor, to my colleague Sandra Carvao, I would like to introduce the panelists with us today. We have Mr. Olivier Ponte, Ms. Sarah Pastor, Mr. Philip Wooler, and Mr. Olivier Henri Biabo. I now give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Sandra Carvao, Chief of Tourism Marketing Intelligence and Competitiveness at the UNWTO. Sandra.
Thank you so much, Basma. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for welcoming us. Thank to all our speakers that join us today, and also to everyone that's connected around the world, in the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world, to learn more of how this pandemic is affecting tourism in the Middle East, and hopefully if there are signs in other parts of the world that can guide us on how we might see recovery coming. I'd like to ask everyone who's on the chat to feel free to use the chat for questions. We will go through the presentations, but if you have questions as they're going, feel free to share them on the chat. We will then put them to the floor to the panelists so that everyone can benefit, as we're also live on YouTube, so everyone can know what the questions that are coming. Before I hand over to our distinguished speakers today, who will give us an insight into the different impacts that the industry is actually having in air transport, consumer sentiment, but also hospitality, I'd just like to share with you the latest assessment of UNWTO in terms of the impact of COVID-19 in international tourism. These results were just published last Tuesday, so they are a reassessment of the impact that COVID is having on tourism. In view of the evolving situation, one of the biggest challenges we have is to understand how travel restrictions will evolve, and obviously how consumer sentiment would also change. And those two factors will be key in seeing the potential impact of tourism in terms of travel. Just to give you an idea of where we are at this point, from the period to January, March, and these are UNWTO latest assessment of impact, as I mentioned, we have 100% destinations worldwide with travel restrictions in response to the pandemic, which means that we are living, as my colleague Basma said, an unprecedented situation of having almost all the world borders closed to tourism. Obviously, essential flights for transport of cargo and medicines are continuing. But from a travel and tourism perspective, we are for the first time in a total halt in activity. What has this meant during the first quarter of this year? We've seen overall a decrease of 22% in international tourist arrivals. The year was starting on a positive note. January, February, we started to see some decline, and March, it was already felt the impact of Asia, but also the shutdown in most of European countries from the mid of the month of March. So we had a 57% decline in March specifically. Asia was the most impacted region, with overall in the first quarter a decline of 35%, Europe 19%, and Middle East a minus 11%, which is, considering the other regions, still not so impacted, but we'll probably see it when we start seeing the results of April. As I said, most of the world is closed at this point. This means that in the whole period of January to March, we lost an estimated 67 million international tourist arrivals compared to the previous years. As I said, it's a widespread impact over the whole regions. And if you look at the volumes of the past year, we're very much going to probably end the year with a result that we've never seen before. Worldwide, as I mentioned before, the situation was quite positive, except for Asia, where after the outbreak in China in the early January, we did see the impact already in February. This will also mean that we will probably lose, at least in these first 3 months, around 80 billion in exports that countries will not have in their balance of payments. If we look ahead, we've asked our panel of experts to indicate when would they see some kind of recovery coming in. And it's very clear that most of the experts do expect international tourism to show some signs of recovery only in 2021, with domestic tourism probably being reactivated first. It's interesting when you look at the Middle East, the sentiment of experts in the Middle East actually is slightly more positive than in the other regions, which is maybe something that we can discuss with all our participants as well. If we look forward, as I mentioned, we have a situation of major uncertainty. So from our side at UNWTO, we're not making forecasts at this point, but we did design 3 scenarios of impact in terms of international tourist arrivals, which are basically connected to the points of opening up of international travel. And it's important to mention that this opening up will probably be very gradual and very uneven in the different regions. So based on those scenarios, we expect that international tourist arrivals could end 2020 with a decline between 58 and 78%, depending on if we see a slight change in restrictions in early July, early September, or if that only happens towards the end of the year. What would that mean? That obviously this would be the highest decline that we have seen in any of our historic series. If we go back to the 50s, we will probably not see the same volume that we will end 2020, which is obviously a huge impact in terms of the industry, but also of jobs and the communities around it. We can have an idea in terms of receipts as well. This could mean that we can lose between 910 billion international dollars from exports until 1.2 trillion. So again, we will go back to levels that we haven't seen in decades. In summary, our potential impact could be between 50 million to 1.5 billion fewer international tourist arrivals, an impact in terms of receipts that could go between 910 billion and 1.2 trillion losses. And if we look into the jobs created by international tourism, 100 to 120 million direct jobs in tourism could actually be at risk. This is very much confirmed by other international organizations looking into the different indicators. ICAO also estimates international passengers traffic to be down between 44 and 80%, depending again on the scenarios. And if you look at the different regions, it also very much varies in the same way. So for example, for the Middle East, the number of passengers could be down between 66 and 120 million, which means a reflection of capacity being cut by between 37 and 70%. As I said, this is a very unprecedented situation, and most of the results will depend on several factors that at this point from our side in the tourism industry, we will be totally dependent on them. How will the pandemic evolve? How will the restrictions actually be lifted in terms of not only domestic travel, but international travel? As my colleague mentioned in the beginning, what would the new normal in the industry mean for supply and demand? We will probably see recovery come in very different parameters. How will consumers react? And we will talk about it later. But also we can't forget the economic impact. The IMF is estimating the world to have a GDP decline of 3%. How will that impact in the later of the year in terms of recovery? And how are governments supporting tourism? That's also a very important point. When we look at expected times of recovery, and again, this is not at all an indication of what can happen now, because we are living a situation that none of us has ever seen in the past. We do see that it takes at least between 10 and 20 months for international tourism to actually recover the loss of arrivals when we look at the world. But when we go a little bit deeper into the regions that were most affected, different crises, for example, you can see that in Asia, after SARS, it took them 14 months for recovery. But in the Americas, after September 11, it took them as much as 3.5 years, 3.5 years to actually go back to previous levels, noting that this was also impacted by the economic crisis of 2001 and also of the compound effect of SARS, which affected Canada in 2003. So as we plan for the future in terms of supply and demand, it's very important to have those into considerations. This is the seasonality of the Middle East. I think this is obviously one of the important points, because depending on where the concentration of demand is, then the impact throughout the year will be bigger or smaller. There is a major concentration of travel around generally the month of the Northern Hemisphere summer, but there is a very good level of demand towards the end of the year. So hopefully, if we start seeing some recovery in the Middle East, this can help as well. There's obviously many challenges and opportunities that we need to transform as we go forward. From UNWTO side, there's a big opportunity that we always like to highlight, which is as we build back, we want to build back better using technology, but also making sure that the impact in our communities and in our heritage and in our planet is taken into consideration. There is also, as we discuss here, data and data availability and the importance of having data-driven decisions and planning, the opportunity to actually use this crisis to invest in better intelligence systems at the national and local level. This will be one probably opportunity that will come out of this crisis. To leave you with a positive note, we trust that we will travel tomorrow. And for that, we hope that data can actually help guide our decisions to make sure that rebound is quicker and more effective. With that in mind, I will stop sharing my screen. And after giving you a very broad view of what we're seeing globally, we're going to enter into the different parts of the value chain. And to start with, I'd like to ask Olivier Ponty from Forward Keys to give us an overview of where we are in terms of air capacity and air bookings. Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. I will share my screen. If you could please, Sandra, confirm that everything is in order.
All good.
All good. All right. So once more, thank you very much for inviting us to this event. My name is Olivier Ponti. I'm VP for Insights at Forward Keys. We are a travel analytics company. We're based in Valencia, Spain, and what we do is very closely monitor air travel. That's our forte. We use different data sets to map the different steps of the traveler's journey, from the searches that people perform on meta search engines prior to their trip, to the capacities that airlines put on the market, to the bookings that are being issued, and the tickets that are being issued as well. So that gives us a pretty comprehensive overview of air travel, and we've got the most complete data sets on direct and indirect bookings in the world. So what do these data tell us about the impact of the current crisis? You can see it on this chart here. This is the year-to-date situation, January to the beginning of May. We have a decrease of minus 57% in the total number of international air arrivals worldwide, with the Asia Pacific being impacted the most heavily. The Middle East with minus 52%. Here is in between, I would say, the most seriously impacted region, and the Americas and Africa, which have been hit a bit later in time, and are registering losses which are very bad, but not as bad as what we could see in the Asia Pacific. Time is important to take into account when trying to understand this crisis, because we can clearly see waves in the epidemic, and those waves translated in different booking behavior. The first wave of the crisis, which started end of January with the introduction of travel restrictions to China, did not impact that much on the Middle East. Here, what you can see are weekly bookings to the Middle East from each of the key source markets. And as you can see, in the first phase of the crisis, it's mainly the Asia Pacific as a source market which was impacted. But from the moment we reached the second wave of the epidemic, and that's it, we hitting Europe particularly, we see a drop in all key source markets to the destination, and very quickly we reached that that threshold here that you see with the dotted line, which means that there are more cancellations than bookings. And since that time, so since the very beginning of March, end of February, beginning of March, the bookings to the destination, to the Middle East, have come to a halt, and we're still below that that threshold. What we're hoping for, all of us in the industry, is to see this red line here, the global line, going up and across this dotted line, which would mean that we would start seeing more bookings than cancellations. That would be the first step to recovery. Air capacity is a reflection of what we have seen on the previous chart, meaning a whole sector coming to a halt. We can see here that the number of international seats on the market is just a fraction of what it was just a year ago, less than 10%, and this impacts all world regions in similar ways. Now, given that we're looking at the Middle East here, it's important to take the hub function of the airports in the region into account, and without surprise, what we can see on this chart is that the hub function has stopped, like any other activity in airports in the past weeks. Those mega hubs are not used for transit anymore. We're at minus 100% for weeks on the number of transit passengers. So it's the whole air ecosystem that is that has stopped. Now, this is very much linked to the fact that most countries in the region, well, actually all countries in the region have implemented travel restrictions, most of the time very tough ones, which basically means that the region is not open for business. Remember, if we would like travel to start again in the region, we would need lifting of travel restrictions in the destinations, but also in the source markets of these destinations, because otherwise that means that people visiting Middle Eastern destinations would, for example, have difficulties going back to their country of origin. So we need lifting of all travel restrictions if we want to see the travel industry picking up again. How does the future look like? We looked at bookings for the summer. As Sandra mentioned, this is an important period for the region. We can see that most bookings for travel between June and August actually take place in the period ranging from May to July. Bookings were pretty much in line with last year until the end of January, when the COVID crisis hit, and then we see a collapse in the number of bookings, and once more from March on, more cancellations than bookings. So the summer outlook looks very, very worrying. Actually, I think we can say now that it's going to be close to impossible to salvage the summer. All key destinations in the region for long-haul travel are behind in similar ways. This ranges from minus 55% for Qatar to minus 71% for Jordan. So a similar range for all destinations. There is no winner in the current crisis. Now, if we look a little bit further down the road and focus on another period which is important for the region, that's the end of the year, September, October, November, and December. Here we focus specifically on October to December. We can see that bookings have come to a halt, but people are not canceling. And that's important. It means that people are waiting to see how the crisis will develop, but they are holding to the bookings that they have already made. So this will be important in case of recovery. It will be easier to pick up for this period because the bookings that have been made are still there. Interesting to notice when looking at searches that people perform is that we have a shift in the period that is considered for a holiday in the Middle East. You can see here the different in searches between 2019 and 2020. You see a shift from the summer season to the end of the year. That's where proportionally we've got much more searches being made. And when looking at the key source markets for those sources, we see also some significant differences compared to last year, with the UK, for example, and the USA joining the top. The USA joining the top 5. The UK registering proportionally much more searches than the rest. So there is interest for a trip to the Middle East, and particularly from the UK. So if we would focus on the UK and on searches that have been performed in the month of April, we see a similar pattern that we've seen when looking at total searches, meaning that there are proportionally much more searches for a trip at the end of the year. So I think this brings some hope. The year is not dead yet. It's still possible to do some business, but more likely towards the end of the year. So I'd like to conclude with by stressing that, yes, this crisis is very severe, but it is also an opportunity for destinations and tourism businesses to be smarter in their use of data. We can see that there are some opportunities very localized on specific markets for specific time periods, and it's really important for you within the sector to identify those opportunities so that you can still make the most of a very, very difficult year. Thank you very much for your attention. And Sandra, back to you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Thank you for giving us that insight, and especially to see some movement, at least in terms of interest, and also interesting point, the fact that the bookings are still there. I also noticed that in the line of recovery, almost going up the level of less cancellations than bookings, the Middle East seems to be in a better position than other regions. I don't know, this is something that you also see in your data.
That's correct. That's correct. Although I think we should be wary of not being too optimistic, I would say. As long as this line is below the or beyond the level of more cancellations than bookings, it means that at some stage, mechanically, we'll go back to minus 100% because that means there will be no more booking to cancel. So first sign of recovery will be to see bookings being well, more bookings than cancellations.
Very good. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's a very important point.
Maybe just to stress that there are still a few bookings being made, but it's for really the end of the year, beginning of next year.
That's very interesting. There's a comment also in the chat that someone says, I can confirm that I do see some peak in Christmas holiday searches from the European Union to the Emirates. So I think just to answer two other questions that came in meanwhile, on the projections that I showed earlier, they are for international travel only. They're not for domestic tourism, and they're very much based in what we saw in the first quarter of the year. The question was if we're taking GDP and consumer recovery confidence into consideration. Not for the moment. It's very much on the opening of international travel. Obviously, the pace of recovery takes into consideration consumer confidence, but it's very much determined by what we've seen so far and the possible dates of opening. So just to clarify that. And without any further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Sara Pastor. She's representing here Adara, who's an affiliate member with you and WTO, and she's gonna give us a deep dive into hotel and air bookings to see where we are in the Middle East. Sara, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Sandra, and thanks for inviting me again. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Can you see my screen properly?
Perfect. All working.
Perfect, thanks. For those who doesn't know Adara, let me give you a bit of background on where we are getting our data. We have partnerships with meta searches, OTA, GDSs, car rental, hotel chains, airlines. So different companies from all the different verticals from the industry. And the first party data that we are gathering are what people are searching, booking, and loyalty program. And what it helps us is to connect the dots on how travelers move from a meta search to an OTA, to an airline or another airline, book the flight and go back to start with the hotel. So it really gives us a holistic understanding on the traveler's behavior. We see more than 850 million unique travelers per month. So that's a lot of travelers, but I always say that it's not only about big data, but it's how we transform it into intelligence, into smart data, so that we can analyze it. And what I would like to show you today, it's a little more on how to help you understand and identify the inflection point that both Basma, Sandra, and Olivier have been mentioning and speaking about, that when it's that opportunity that we see from particular origin markets or domestic, and that can give us a hint on when to relaunch the recovery plans. Let me show you first, it's the Middle East year over year, hotel and flight searches combined. And when we look also this in aggregated globally and many regions, it's very similar to what Olivier showed in terms of specifically for flights. It's very similar when we aggregate also hotel data. There is clear decline. And if we look also at the specific, I just took 4 examples of Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. Obviously, when we look at the historical data from beginning of the year to where we are now, it's still declining and it's still very flat. We are not seeing yet this upward trend that would give us a hint for the inflection point. However, I'm always very optimistic. And I think that it's really important to keep an eye on how China is reacting. Obviously, that does not mean that the Middle East region or other regions in the world, we are going to follow the steps of China. But I think it's really important as the first country affected by the COVID-19 to look at how they are evolving. And as I've shown you for the Middle East, you know, the searches and bookings as an historical trend, I'm adding here another layer of separating the international travelers that actually Sandra was mentioning, that your numbers were international, but also to look at the domestic. But given the situation, most probably the first markets that they are going to reactivate are the domestic or proximity markets. And if we look at China, it is true that obviously they had a big decline, and you can look at the dark purple line is the international, and the light purple line is the domestic. And as you can see, obviously the international went down as they got better in terms of cases, and they started to reopen the borders, went up again. They implemented new restrictions since they were scared of, you know, the reactivation of the virus, so went down again. But the good news is that we are seeing again another upward trend. When we look at the domestic, it's more flat. It has had a very soft upward trend with ups and downs. And I think this is really interesting because when people ask if we are going to have either a V or a U in terms of recovery, my guess it would be that we are going to have more ups and downs, because, you know, we will have to wait for, as Olivier was mentioning, all borders to open, you know, the security protocols. So see how that's going, if this is not increasing the cases. So I would really recommend, and we will keep an eye on how China is evolving. Another data that I think it's really important when we look at the trends to identify this inflection point, it's not only seen domestic, international, or aggregated, or depending on the different destinations, but it's also understanding the different types of travelers, because business and leisure, they are not going to react in the same way. And when we look at leisure, families, couples, solo, they are not going to react the same way. This is the EMEA trends when we look at global, specific for hotels, for bookings. As you can see, they were very similar until obviously the leisure audience started to go down before business, which makes sense. They were more sensitive in terms of not traveling if they didn't have to, while the business travelers, it took them a little bit more to start going down. And when it is true that we don't have still data on what's going to react, but most of our conversations that we are looking is that probably the leisure audience is the one that we are seeing a little bit more pickups in terms of searches. And that's because business travelers, probably there are going to be a lot of companies that they are going to be very wary of sending their employees and trying to avoid for them to get infected and avoid legal measures of the employees towards the company. So what we are seeing is a little bit more of pickups in terms of the leisure, but obviously that depends on the destination. And when we look at the leisure travelers, here what I've added is the trip planning. So these leisure travelers that they are now searching for the EMEA destinations is, when are they searching for? Are they searching in the short term, like 0 to 15 days? Or are they searching more for longer? And this is very similar to what Olivier was showing. So most of the travelers, they are searching for plus 90 days. And you can see here how the 90 days window of advanced purchase has gone up. So that means people, they are really want to travel, but they want to make sure they can travel. So they are postponing the travel dates. And last but not least, I've shown you until now more historical data, but obviously it's important to look at the future. And what I wanted to show you here and share with you is the year-over-year searches to Europe and also the Middle East. It is true that in both cases, when we look at the next weeks for the travel dates, it's still negative. We don't see that yet searches being higher this year versus last year. However, what is interesting here, and I always recommend, is to look at the trend that we are seeing. In Europe, we are seeing a little bit getting better for end of May. And that's because it is true that I think the expectations of people of being able to travel or do a getaway for the weekend, that's when it got better. Then it stabilizes, and the big change comes at the end of August, beginning of September. While if we look at the Middle East, it's actually from now until beginning of August, it's really an upward trend. It's very clear, except for a couple of peaks. It's really going up. And the biggest change again comes end of August, beginning of September. So as Oliver showed, we really see both searches, and also whenever we look at bookings, the peaks are coming in Q4. So that's good. And we truly see an opportunity on how you can start targeting those people who are actively searching for those travel periods. And if I can conclude for you to have a summary on how I would keep an eye to this inflection point, it's keep analyzing searches and bookings to be able to compare the intent versus the actual booking of both hotel and flights. And I think it's really important also to separate hotel and flight, because for the proximity markets, neighboring markets, it's going to be important to have the hotel data separated to see how the intent and the trends are of the behavior are working. Keep an eye of the historical, but also on the future data on how people are searching into the future. I would highly recommend for the short term to keep a micro level analysis, really look into those proximity and domestic markets, see how they are behavior, but do not forget to keep analyzing for the mid-long term, the more macro level, and see how the long haul markets are behaving and how they are opening borders and how their travelers are starting to search and where to which destinations. China, it's going to be really interesting to keep an eye on and see how they are evolving. Please, I highly recommend really look into the different audiences, which are the ones for your for your destination are reactivating sooner, so that you can address them and personalize the communication plans to them. And last but not least, I would highly recommend to combine all this data that we have with air capacity that Olivier shown, because we can have borders open. People might be searching in those origin markets, but if there is no air capacity to get to your destinations, that's going to make it really complicated. And the second point that I think it's really interesting to combine with all this data would be the perception, the security perception index, because again, if from those origin markets, the vision that they have for your destination is that it's not yet secure to travel, that's going to make it hard. So I think like looking at this more holistic view of data, it's going to help you to identify those different origin markets, the different inflection points, so that it's going to help you know when the recovery plans need to be launched. And as a final note, I know that I repeat myself always, but please use, as Olivier was saying, use this opportunity to really create this intelligence system and to keep on analyzing and learning from the data, acting on the data, and measure if what you've done actually has been effective and efficient, so that you can learn again and you can create this virtuous cycle that it's going to help you cope with this crisis in a better way and more efficient way. And not only for that, but it will accompany you in the rest of the vision that you have for your destination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for sharing that information. I think there's not enough stressing on that point. Building in tourism information systems is really critical, both at national as at destination level. And today, big data allows us to combine traditional data, while it's important to advance with traditional statistics to make sure that those are complemented by big data from the different areas. And we've just seen a few examples here. It's the combination that can give you the full, complete picture. And I think that's a very important point. I will, yes, Basma, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may comment on Sarah's point that keeping an eye on China, although we might not need to do what they're doing in this situation. China, we all know that China has a special culture of surveillance. And this surveillance control culture helped the country in combating this the spread of this virus. I read that they had thermal detectors in the train and the train stations to measure the temperature. They also telecom providers were able to produce an integrated data to show where this person was or went in the last 14 days to decide whether this person needs to be quarantined or not. So all of these factors helped China control the spread of virus. Yes, I mean, I agree with you. We can't, not every country has the same culture, but this is also one of the reasons why they're controlling the spread of the virus.
Definitely. And I just show it because, you know, there is a lot of, I've been in many webinars and people are saying like how it's going to be, right? This inflection point and which shape. And I think that's why it's interesting to keep an eye on China, because it's not a straight line of, oh, this is getting better. And it's just like a straight line upward. It's up and downs. And I truly feel that that's what we are going to see. It's up and downs depending on the measures that the destinations are taking, the measures that the origin markets are taking. So there are a lot of factors that they will determine on how this inflection point and this new curve shape has. So it just try, keep on having an eye on how they are doing and then compare it to, our origin markets and destinations.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think also the point of, we always say that anonymized data is what we're talking about here, and the use of that for destination management is critical. I'd like to now go deep into the hospitality sector and invite Philip Fuller from STR, who's with us, to share his insights. There's a point that has come often in the questions in Zoom, which is the issue of how will the sector adapt to the new rules and protocols and social distancing needs, and obviously that will have also an impact into the capacity of many hotels to reopen, and someone the other day talked about reopening point more than break-even point. So I think we're going to see some changes also in the challenges that the hospitality sector faces in this reopening phase. But without any further comment from my side, I'll leave the floor to Philippe.
Thank you, Sandra. Let me just share my screen. Is that okay? Can you?
Yes, we can see it.
Is that the full screen? Yes.
No, it's not full.
Sorry, give me a minute.
No worries. Well,
I have two screens now, and it's quite new to me. So
that's
no. Oh. Hang on.
Well, meanwhile, while Philippe tries to share his screen, I'll just comment that I've shared in the Zoom some resources from the side of UNWTO. There were some questions about UNWTO recommendations for the restart. We are currently working on a set of guidelines for the reopening, which will be available throughout the end of this month. But there's also, and I shared the link in the Zoom, specific recommendations for the different phases of mitigation, recovery, and preparation for the future, which are mostly addressed at governments and how they should actually support the sector. So you're very welcome to read through them. And I think, Philippe, your screen is now working, right?
Okay, super.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sandra. Okay, we've only got a few minutes, so I will run through these pretty quickly. I wish I had better news, but I think some possible consolation is I do think we have bottomed out and things will start to improve. It's still going to be a rocky road, but let's have a look to see where we're heading. So I just, this is quite a new slide. We've been tracking the hotel closures across the planet. It is a very, very difficult thing to do, but we have made some significant progress. And this will give you an idea of how many hotels are closed, certainly from a percentage point of view, all across the planet. And it is quite a scary picture. The bigger numbers out of Europe, 76% of hotels are closed, Central South America, less in North America, but a very, very big hotel market. So really just giving you a sense of what is happening. In the Middle East, about 36% of all hotels are closed. So been a very, very tough time. In terms of the occupancy, now this is for Q1, quarter one. For the entire planet, we were running at about 49.4%, and this will give you some indication of the occupancies for Q1. It doesn't tell the full picture because January and February were a little bit busier, but this is how the first quarter looks. But I think this probably is more of an important picture. So this is the global occupancy for the whole of April. So just 1 month, but I think this tells the full story, and really we have pretty much hit rock bottom. So some of these markets are as low as Europe. You can see there as low as 10% occupancy. In North America, 23% occupancy. And normally the sort of the area for these regions would be more in the 65 to 70% occupancy. So we can see quite clearly what the declines are. In the Middle East, a smaller market. So the occupancy across the Middle East, currently 30.5% for April. And the RevPAR picture, well, I think we all know that the revenue with a very, very low occupancy and very little business in the hotels, then RevPAR has nowhere else to go than decline quite severely. So this is the revenue per available room percent change, effectively accommodation revenue. Where has it dropped in the month of April? So significant declines all across the planet. And in the Middle East, 74% decline. But in Europe, I mean, considerably bigger at 90% decline. So I think we can all see the scale of the problem very, very easily. Looking more specifically at the Middle East, I'm just going to touch on these actually because these are the closures across some of the Middle Eastern cities. So it does give you an idea of what has happened. I also think it's important to understand that the sample of reporting hotels has changed quite dramatically. So obviously if a number of luxury hotel closes in a city like Doha or Abu Dhabi, then before we even start looking at the data, we are going to see a big decline in the average room rates. So something to bear in mind. Like at the same time, if we are looking at a 20% occupancy on 50% of the supply, then that would be an economic occupancy of about 10%. So just something to bear in mind. It's not a like for like, but that will give some idea of the percentage of rooms closed in the Middle East in some of these cities. And where do we stand? I know these are fairly big numbers, but just really to give you a sense of the changes from Q1 2019 to Q1 2020. And we can see that occupancy has declined for the first quarter by 16-17%, average room rate 7 or 8%, and revenue per available room 23%. This region did actually do very, very well in January and February. In fact, it was the highest of any region, outperformed all other region in all three of the key metrics there. And the closest competitor was North America at 51% occupancy, so and $123. So you can see that the Middle East has performed very well in Jan, Feb, but obviously March has had quite a big impact on the data. And looking ahead, so for Q2, you can see what the Middle East performed at: 62%, 146 average rate US dollars, and 90 USD RevPAR. Now, it is a very, very difficult period for the Middle East, particularly some markets where we are, at the moment, we're halfway through Ramadan. We then get into the summer months. So it's a fairly tough period from a hospitality point of view. Now, I've just looked at the sort of indicators for Q2 2020. This is not an official number. I just want to make that clear. This is where I think the occupancies and the average room rates will move over Q2 2020, and it's significant. A drop of maybe 53%, 50%. From 62 to 29%, average room rate, a further drop of 29%, and also the big number in terms of RevPAR, a 66% drop from 90 to 30. And I think that is where we will be at the end of Q2. So it is a very, very tough period. Interestingly, looking at the data from we roll this from the 1st of February 2020. We can see the declines very, very clearly. We saw that in the airline industry as well. I think if you look towards the right-hand side, you could probably argue that things are beginning to improve. I think they are, for sure. But I also think we need to be a little bit cautious, because I think now there is quite a lot of business in the hotels that is connected to the virus, and that would be the quarantine hotels, medical facilities, where hotels have been taken over for the purpose of dealing with some of the problems generated by the virus. So at the same time, I do think we have made significant changes across the region in terms of lifting of restrictions, but at the same time, cases are unfortunately still on the rise. So we'll have a look at the data. I think the next 2 or 3 weeks will be very pivotal, but that's where we stand at the moment. So some glimmer of hope. In terms of some of the key cities, I think on the right-hand side, Qatar and Abu Dhabi are the regional leaders. Now, both of those markets have had a pretty tough time over the last few years for a number of reasons, new supply being one of them. But currently, Qatar is operating at about 50% occupancy, and Abu Dhabi 48% occupancy. And in the Eastern Province, where a lot of the oil refineries are in Saudi Arabia, 45% occupancy. So relatively strong. On the other end of the scale, obviously, we've got the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. I think significant challenges for the foreseeable future, certainly for the rest of 2020. Ramadan obviously is a difficult time, and I think the Hajj season is also under threat. Jeddah, although dwindling occupancies and demand, average room rates are quite strong, and Kuwait City, always a strong average room rate, despite the fact demand is pretty poor. So just really giving you an idea of where we sit. The blue dot occupancy and the red is the scale of the average room rate on the left-hand side. Moving through, this is for just really a snapshot of time. I think it's interesting to see Riyadh there last week was operating at an occupancy of 66%. Again, I think quarantine and medical reasons are one reason for the strong occupancy, but that's a higher occupancy than Riyadh normally sort of operates at this time of the year. Huge challenges in Beirut, in Amman, in Jordan, Kuwait City. So pretty tough all the way around. You can see Jeddah, Doha, and Abu Dhabi a little bit stronger. And then when we look at the forecasts for the regions, again, very, very big numbers. We know some markets and some cities will operate at a higher level and some at a lower level. But I think in any event, we can see the incredible challenges for the hotel industry for the rest of the year. China on the left-hand side, we think RevPAR will drop by 31%. We have seen some more encouraging data in China. So yeah, that's where we are looking for China. In The US, I mean, that's going to be hit pretty bad for the whole of 2020, a 51% decline in RevPAR and a 43% decline in occupancy. The European markets, perhaps less affected, but there are still some serious declines. And the Middle East, just as I just got to mention, this is what I think. This is not an official number for STR. This is what I think will be the roundabout number, a 54% decline in RevPAR. It has come at a very, very difficult time with the summer, and that's where I think we will end up for the full year. I think, you know, I mentioned sort of a little bit briefly, I think we're certainly not through the worst of this. I think, you know, there is some way to go, but I think some of the economies are trying to get back on their feet. It will be a kind of a long and rocky road, but I just thought I'd put some of my top tips in for the summer for any of the hoteliers who are on the call. And I do think, you know, that quite clearly the situation is we don't think there's going to be an awful lot of air travel over the summer period. A lot of the people, a lot of the residents in the UAE and further afield have been cooped up for some time. And hopefully, if we start to contain this problem to a bigger degree, then there will be some sort of movement. And I think there will be some opportunity for hotels. I was reading about some of the bigger companies on what they're doing to the safety precautions they're putting in place, like Hilton and Marriott, and they are really quite incredible. And I think people will begin to feel a little more comfortable over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And there is an opportunity or a possibility that over the summer months, some of these beach properties, the resort properties might do quite well. Ras Al Khaimah with the mountains, the cooler climates, the fantastic beaches. I think there's opportunity for some of the resort hotels there. Even Dubai downtown, you know, things have got to move again, putting these precautions into place. I think there is opportunity for some of the hotels downtown as well. Further afield, Abu Dhabi, which particularly around the Corniche and Saadiyat Island and maybe Yas Island, I think there is opportunity there. Oman, some of the resorts, I think could do very well, and Musandam. I'm not sure we've got an awful lot of hotels up there, but I think I'm basically saying that there might be a lot of interregional travel, and you know, under the right conditions, I think some of these properties could do very well. So I think that is it. So I will hand you back to Sandra. I hope that gave you a very, very quick rundown of what is happening. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I don't know if there's questions specifically to Philippe, but I do have one, and I do understand that your forecast is not an official one, but as someone who's very close to the data, I'd just like to ask you to explain a little bit of what reasons lead you to think that you will see a slower KPI results in the Middle East. And also, surprisingly, in the US, where there is a big domestic market, which we do hope to see some recovery first.
Yeah, well, I think the Middle East, it's all about timing. Well, it's not all about timing. A lot of the markets operate in very, very different ways. One reason why I think it will be incredibly difficult is certain markets, and I would probably be drawn to some of the Saudi markets, the holy cities. You know, that is going to be... If things don't change there, and I can't really see it changing there for some time, that will drag the data down quite considerably. But as I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, there will be some markets that might do quite well, particularly the resorts, the beach properties. But again, if you look at Dubai, with the size of the market, it is one of the largest hotel markets in the world. And that doesn't bode well for the summer months, particularly with this problem. So occupancies will be very, very challenged. I think room rate challenged, and so is RevPAR. So I think in a nutshell, it's because of the very different ways some of these cities operate, and particularly through the summer months. Whereas Europe is more consistent, more of a mature market, will probably do a little bit better. The US, it is a good point. 50% down. I wasn't responsible for forecasting the Middle East, but I rather the US, and I was a little bit surprised to see those numbers. And we will just have to monitor them. But I think it's perhaps the scale of the problem over there and being the sort of at the moment, the central area for the virus, it might take a little bit more time to pass through.
Thank you very much for that, Philip. Just,
Thank you.
I think that's a very important point in taking into consideration also what you mentioned, that many hotel chains which have a strong presence in the region are very much active in implementing and developing protocols to manage the reopening, and that hopefully will also create confidence. That takes me to one question that just came in the chat, which is the perspectives for the MICE industry, which we know that all are much more complicated. And I think we all expect to see corporate travel coming in, especially at individual level in a first phase. And probably it's still too early to have an idea of when we will see MICE travel in the sense of events coming actually to any pre-crisis levels. Very good. So I think we've, just to summarize for those who are with us and for those who have reached us later, we went through a set of data in terms of airlines, hotel industry. And one of the big points that many of you are commenting in the chat is when will consumer confidence recover? And I think the next presentation will give us a little bit of hints. Not answering the question because we don't have a crystal ball, and our speaker will probably tell you that, but I think it will tell you where to look for that information. So I give the floor now to Olivier Henri Bibot, who will present about the consumer insights through social media. Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandra. You have spoiled my introduction. Thank you very much and good morning,
Spoiler,
everyone.
I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. Yeah, the crystal ball question. I think the only thing we can say looking forward is people will first, probably by the end of this year, travel where they can and when they can afford and when they have to for visiting friends, relatives, probably for business. And then probably not before 2021, early 2021, people will at last travel where they want to travel. And this is exactly where the reputation of destinations will be absolutely massively influence travelers' choices. Because basically people will tend to choose a destination they really trust, and the destinations which have been less impacted in terms of reputation throughout the crisis. So here in the following slides, I'm going to mention it's not really only consumer confidence. We are running a couple of surveys to track the impact on the planning from pure travelers' point of view, but it's e-reputation at large. So that includes all the sharing, all the conversations from companies, from the media, from consumers or citizens, brands and officials. So it's really e-reputation at large, and we know that this reputation is going to somehow influence favorability towards traveling overall and towards destination's choice very, very soon. If we summarize, I mean, from the beginning of the crisis, there's been not less than 1.4 billion social conversations on all social channels online, mentioning COVID-19 in the context of travel and tourism. So it means that still today, when people talk about travel tourism in the Middle East, and there is about 1 in 3 social conversations mentioning the virus. And of course, many of those stories, many of those conversations are negative. It's all about, people trapped in airports, trapped in hotels, in cruise or destinations which have been portrayed as kind of epicenters of the outbreaks or very bad in managing the problems. Many things around refunding, things about travel insurances, airlines developing or pointed out as developing the problems and the outbreak. A lot of disrespect between visitors and residents. And, the whole concept that at the end of the day, some beautiful destinations in Middle East are very beautiful again without any tourism. Wildlife and nature coming back. So it's not good, of course, in terms of the image for the sector, and for many destinations, it has been sometimes extremely unfair the way they've been exposed in the travel and tourism related conversations. But having said that, we are seeing now positive momentum. It seems that the whole industry, travel sector's image is already restored halfway. These indicators is showing you the polarity of conversations, positive versus negative. And you see that in the coming now, since let's say probably a few weeks, so starting somehow from beginning of April, sorry, we are seeing a lot of growing positive conversations about travel and tourism overall, and especially because you have many fans of destinations sharing their souvenirs, many discussions now, people projecting again and discussing about their next plans, their next destination choices, a lot of virtual reality, which managed to keep the link between potential visitors and the destinations, a lot of great stories about local heroes and, you know, attractions reopening, some destinations announcing they are going to reopen. So we are now again in a trust which is more and more positive. We don't have the numbers we used to have in the past before the crisis, but we are somehow halfway. For the region in particular, if we compare the polarity of conversations about Middle East, which in this case is the average of all major destinations and travel brands in the Middle East, you see the green line, and the green line tends to show that actually Middle East have been relatively spared if you compare with other regions like the US or China, of course, or Europe. It seems like Middle East have been impacted, of course, like any destinations in terms of reputation, but the recovery seems to be faster than other regions. It's actually following Asia overall, not China, but Asia overall, which is good. But it means that the potential for considering again Middle East is going to come back sooner than maybe other destinations in the world in you know, the reputation and travelers, potential travelers' mind overall. Now, it's interesting to see that obviously not everybody is being impacted the same way. So I'm not going to comment much about those destinations in Middle East, which maybe have suffered a lot, because I want to keep some friends in the audience, but just spotting out two examples there. One is Dubai, which is a major brand, and the other one is Alula, which is a kind of a not completely new destination, but a bit, let's say, new on the international map. So if you look at the comparison of reputation, Middle East overall in average, and those two destinations, you see that Dubai as well as Alula have not been impacted so much. The reason for Dubai is it's a very strong brand, and there's been very soon a lot, I would say hundreds and hundreds of Dubai fans all over the world who have done the role of fueling the dream again, sharing souvenirs, sharing tips, and, you know, without, sometimes pushed by the DMO, but also many times just pushed by people, you know, in a very spontaneous way, taking care of restoring the brand reputation. And for a destination like Alula, of course, Alula has been closed since the beginning of the year because it's a new destination. As you probably know, there's only this large event during winter in Tantora, but it's a new destination. And that destination in particular, we have not seen anything particularly mentioning as a negative during the same period for Alula. So it's starting with a brand equity, which is absolutely not impacted by the virus at all. So depending on the destination, the impact can be very, very different. But what we see is the role of the fans of destinations, which are able to protect your destination brand for you, and it's usually free of charge. Now, taking into consideration the impact into different verticals, we have also there a lot of discrepancy throughout the crisis period. This is globally, but it really reflects the same trends in Middle East. You have, on the one hand, all the verticals about transportations, so airports, airlines, which, as you can see on the curve, have been massively impacted negatively and still are struggling a lot to restore confidence. Whereas on the top of the graph, you see attractions, cultural attractions, leisure attractions, which have been impacted. They still need to restore somehow their reputation, but way less. So what it means is that people it's easier today for people to project into consider an attractions, consider an experiences, specific experiences in the destination, rather than easily project into taking an airline, passing through an airport. The cruise industry is a bit in between. It's an attraction, but it's also transportation. So they are kind of suffering. It's rebounding in positive again, but they are quite suffering. So what it means, for example, for a destination like Abu Dhabi, if we look at the year-to-date reputation of Abu Dhabi, it's positive, it's 52, but it's way less than it used to be before. They are recovering very fast, and they are already kind of restored about 70% of the brand equity and the desired or the sentiment toward Abu Dhabi. But if you compare during the same period the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, there were no impact. So conversations about Louvre in Abu Dhabi are still very positive, and the impact is very kind of anecdotal when you consider specific attractions. So I will leave you with a couple of drivers. So what are the main concerns or the main qualitative sentiment we can learn from social listening exercise globally? And I'm just commenting on 3 of them, which are particularly important, we believe, in your region, Middle East. One is celebrating reopening is certainly a very good idea, but make sure that when you reopen a destination, when you reopen an attraction, you make it in a very sustainable way, because one of the aspects pre-existing, which has been enhanced by the COVID-19 crisis, is all about sustainability, environmental protection, and so on. So it has to be done. It's nice to celebrate, but it's a key critical moment for communication. So make sure you do it in a very sustainable way. Another aspect is related to those verticals I mentioned, which have been very much impacted negatively. Airports, cruise, airlines. Those are not attractions usually. They are just, well, there are a few exceptions, especially in the Middle East. Some airports are really attractions, but in overall, people have a lot of concern about that. So in terms of destination management, destination post-COVID preparation, it's super important to restore the overall destination through those particular verticals who have been damaged. And in particular, in Middle East, of course, Middle East is a major destination itself, but it's also very much known as a hub. And there are many destinations in Middle East, as you know, which are also positioning on transit travel. And because it's a hub from Europe to Asia, for example, it's going to be very important to restore the reputation also as a transportation hub, because as I said, it's been impacted very much negatively. And then the role of frontline travel and tourism staff in airports, in information centers, all the tourist guides, receptionists in hotels, transport, public transport agents, all these people are going to be the one in contact with post-COVID-19 new visitors. And they are going to be the one spreading the communication, the one that people need to trust. And though it's very important to give them the central role in communicating the rules and the new rules and in spreading the positive reputation. Because of course, your reputation tomorrow are not only provided by and fueled by your communication today, which are great. In many cases, we see a lot of fabulous communication from destination to restore the link. But the first time experience will create your reputation tomorrow, because 40% of international travelers choose destination based on friends and relatives. So what people will hear from first-time visitors in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Egypt, Iran, it will shape your reputation tomorrow. So that will go from these basic contact points with your people at destination. So that's it for me. So it's a mix of a lot of vigilance points and a lot of also kind of new positive. We are now in a momentum that you know, travel tourism is again on the plan, and we see that very much tangibly in social listening. There's a positive role. So it's really time now to restore that positive reputation in your destination and attractions. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I think a couple of points that I would probably stress that Olivier mentioned, which are the keeping the relationship between the destination and the listeners at this point online, which is very important to keep your destination in the mind of prospect travelers in the future. And the second one is, and I think this always happens in times of crisis, is to focus on specific attractions or activities or experiences rather than the country brand, which might have been less or more affected through the managing of the crisis or the impact of the crisis. Also because then there's not the association immediately with traveling to a country, but rather that experience is something that really touches me directly. I want to have it, and then the country comes at a second stage. And the second point, I think, is the reopening with responsibility. I think need to be very careful with the reopening. One of the critical points will be the protocols in place and how they're communicated to consumers. That will be an issue for raising confidence that people see that the protocols exist, that they are being implemented. And for that, the frontline staff is obviously one of the key elements. There's been a lot of questions actually in the chat around reopening protocols and if we have guidelines on them. And it's one of the challenges that will exist in the sector. First of all, the protocols will be different, obviously, through the value chain. You'll have hotels, attractions, airlines, airports, each of them with their specificities. There's entities working already to advance them. Big hotel chains are developing them for their own hotels. At national level, we're based in Madrid, as UNWTO. Spain has just released a set of protocols for different areas of the tourism value chain together with the private sector and the health authorities. So I think it's time we can learn from each other. I don't think anyone has the complete truth at this moment or the solution that solves everything. But I think sharing experiences can be one of the steps forward. So for those interested, those protocols in Spain and in Portugal are advancing. And I know that major hotel chains are also advancing, as it was mentioned by Philippe before. I also have a couple of questions which are more specific. I think a colleague in the chat was asking Philippe about hotels in Egypt. And I don't know, Philippe, if you have any insights that you could share on that.
Hotels in Egypt. I put a little bit on the spot. We do have data for Egypt, but I think a very, very similar situation to all other countries. It is a leisure destination, so it has been seriously impacted, particularly Sharm el-Sheikh, those type of areas. Cairo a little bit stronger, but it's in a similar sort of boat to everywhere else. Occupancies around at sort of 15 to 18% occupancy. So I'm afraid at the moment, no real change. I think some of the restrictions have been lifted, partially lifted, but until we get through the next stage, I don't think anything really is going to happen too much. So that's where we stand at the moment.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I think that's an important point. I've also shared in the chat the link to a tool that we've just released from UNWTO, which is a dashboard where you can access the data for the countries that have it. And obviously, we're limited by the fact that countries report data or not. And also, as it was mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, data reporting is also a challenge in the current circumstances for most of the countries. And we do see, obviously, that those markets where the domestic demand represents a bigger chunk will probably be less vulnerable in this moment. And you can see in the dashboard the ones where domestic tourism has a bigger weight in terms of hotel guests. So I think with that, I would just leave it from our side at the Tourism Market Intelligence and Competitiveness Department with a last note, which is to thank our panelists. I think we tried to give you a complete overview of what the data is telling us, but also what the data can tell you as destinations and how you can use it in the combined way, looking into the different KPIs, investing in systems that allow you to do a follow-up of those indicators and act whenever it's necessary. I think this is a critical issue, and I hope that together we can actually continue to move this agenda forward, because I think it will be critical to manage recovery if we don't understand what is the consumer sentiment or even the resident sentiment, as Olivier mentioned, because we might have issues of populations in tourism areas when reopening that they might not feel very welcoming to people coming from the outside. And we need to monitor that. We need to be aware so that we can manage and we can communicate in a proper way. So with that said, we are at your disposal at UNWTO to continue this conversation. I want to thank again Sarah, Olivier, Philip, and Olivier for joining us. This was the 5th of our webinars. We went through all the regions, so it's been a tour of the world. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope that we will repeat it at some time soon, giving some positive news of something that we will see when we can all work to make sure that the pandemic is contained and that we can actually open with responsibility. That said, I'll leave the floor to Bashma to close this webinar, thanking all the participants that joined us today.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everyone. I believe we have more than 400 people registered for this webinar, and we have other people also watching us on YouTube. Thank you all for taking the time for being with us, and I would like to thank also our panelists for the information they shared with everyone. The rise of the tourism industry did not happen overnight, so the recovery as well will not happen overnight. For our stakeholders in the industry, we advise them to use this downtime to reevaluate their businesses, train employees, and try to develop new products to become more flexible and look for other opportunities. Airlines, hotels, try to have more options for cancellation. We must all be prepared for quick changes, and there is no time to waste. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you in more webinars in the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, and stay safe.
Stay safe. Bye.